In 2012, a black geologist vanished while conducting research in Joshua Tree National Park. The official search concluded he was another tragic victim of the desert's unforgiving nature. For a full year, that was the only story. Then, in 2013, a graduate student's drone-based mapping project revealed a digital ghost on the landscape, a sealed, hidden structure that shouldn't exist. The discovery would lead rangers back to a long-forgotten mine, to a man who had been erased from the world, and to a truth buried deep beneath the earth. Before we begin, thank you for being here with us. This is a story about survival against all odds and a testament to the enduring power of hope. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from today? Knowing you're out there, bearing witness with us, means everything. We are in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The silence of Joshua Tree National Park in the spring of 2012 was a physical presence. It was a silence composed of the whisper of wind over sun-baked granite, the distant cry of a hawk, and the immense, patient weight of geological time. For Dr. Omari Benton, a brilliant university professor and geologist, this silence was not empty. It was a library. Every rock, every stratum, every twisted, ancient Joshua tree told a story, and he was here to listen. At 35, Omari moved through the landscape with a quiet, confident grace. He was a scientist, but also a true outdoorsman, a man who felt more at home in the stark, honest beauty of the desert than in the hushed halls of academia. His current research grant had brought him to the park's rugged, less-traveled eastern edge, to the abandoned mining district that surrounded the long-defunct Scorpion's Tooth mine. He was studying the unique pegmatite intrusions in the area, the crystalline veins that had drawn prospectors here a century ago. On a clear, warm Tuesday, as he was carefully chipping a sample from a granite outcrop, a figure appeared on the ridge above him. It was a man, gaunt and weathered as the landscape itself, his skin the texture of tanned leather, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue. He moved with a slow, deliberate shuffle, a human echo of the desert tortoise. "That's good rock you're chipping at," the man said, his voice a dry, gravelly rasp, full of tourmaline. "My granddaddy used to pull stones the size of a man's fist out of this very hill." Omari, startled from his concentration, stood up. "I'm sorry, I didn't see you there. I'm Dr. Benton. I have a research permit from the Park Service." "I know who you are," the man said, his gaze lingering on Omari with an unsettling intensity. "They told me a professor was coming out to poke at my family's bones. Name's Jedediah Kane. My people were here before this was a park, before there were roads. This land remembers my name." There was a proprietary, almost threatening edge to his words that made Omari uneasy. He had heard about Kane from the Rangers, an eccentric old prospector, the last descendant of the family that had owned the Scorpion's Tooth. He was considered harmless, a living relic who sometimes helped with his encyclopedic knowledge of the park's forgotten trails. "It's incredible history," Omari said politely, trying to steer the conversation back to neutral ground. "The geology here is unlike anywhere else on Earth." "It is," Kane agreed, his pale eyes scanning the vast expanse of rock and sand. "And it don't like being disturbed." With that, he gave a curt nod and shuffled away, disappearing back over the ridge as silently as he had appeared. Omari, unsettled, packed up his samples and headed back to his Jeep, which he had parked on a dusty, barely there access road. As he got closer, he saw the problem. The Jeep was listing heavily to one side. Two of his tires, the thick, rugged, all-terrain kind, were completely flat, slashed open with a sharp, deliberate violence. A cold knot of anger and dread formed in his stomach. This was no accident. He was miles from the nearest paved road, with no cell service. He looked around at the vast, indifferent landscape. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt menacing. As if summoned by his predicament, Jedediah Kane reappeared, walking slowly down the road toward him. "Looks like you got some trouble," he said, a faint, unreadable expression on his face. "Someone slashed my tires," Omari said, his voice tight. Kane clicked his tongue. "Damn kids from town, probably. No respect. Tell you what, my cabin ain't but 2 miles from here." You can come on back with me. Use my phone to call the ranger station. They can send someone out for you in the morning." Omari hesitated. Every instinct told him to refuse, to start the long, dangerous walk back to the main road himself. But he looked at the setting sun, the shadows stretching long and purple across the desert floor. He knew how quickly the temperature would drop. He knew the dangers of being stranded out here at night. Kane's offer, however unsettling, was the only logical choice. "All right," Omari said reluctantly. "Thank you. I appreciate it." The walk to the cabin was a quiet, tense affair. Kane's home was a small, ramshackle structure built of sun-bleached wood and corrugated tin, nestled in a hidden canyon, miles from any designated trail. It felt like a place outside of time. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled of dust, wood smoke, and something else, something metallic and vaguely unpleasant. Kane gestured to a rickety wooden chair. "Sit yourself down. I'll get you some water. You look parched." He returned with a tin cup filled with cool, clear water from a hand pump. Omari, his throat dry from the desert heat and the stress of the situation, drank it gratefully. It tasted clean, refreshing. He drained the cup. As he set it down, a wave of dizziness washed over him, sudden and overwhelming. The edges of his vision began to blur. The room tilted. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't respond. He saw Kane watching him, his face no longer that of a harmless eccentric, but of a patient predator. What did you?" Omari stammered, his tongue thick and clumsy in his mouth. "Just some desert herbs," Kane said, his voice calm. "Help a man get his rest. You city folk ain't used to the quiet. It can make a man's mind race." The last thing Omari saw before the darkness swallowed him completely was Kane's pale blue eyes, as cold and empty as the desert sky at midnight. He awoke to a profound, absolute blackness. He was lying on cold, damp stone. The air was thick, stale, and smelled of earth and decay. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, disconnected. He sat up slowly, his head pounding. He reached out, his hands finding the rough, curved wall of his prison. It was stone, lined with mortar. He was in a pit, a well of some kind. He looked up. There was no light, no stars, nothing. Just an impenetrable ceiling of black. And then he heard it. A sound from above. A heavy, grating scrape. The sound of a massive stone slab being dragged into place. It settled with a deep, final thud that seemed to shake the very earth around him. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of a tomb. He screamed, his voice a raw, ragged thing that was swallowed by the stone, echoing back at him, mocking him. He was a geologist, a man who understood the earth. And he knew, with a sudden, horrifying certainty, that he had just been buried alive. The search and rescue operation was massive. For a week, teams scoured the park. Helicopters crisscrossed the sky. Led Ranger Silas Croft, a man whose face was a roadmap of long, hard years in the desert, led the ground search. He was experienced, cynical, and had seen this story play out a dozen times. He was a smart guy, a professor, Croft told Omari's frantic sister, Dr. Imani Benton, at the command post. But the desert doesn't care how smart you are. One wrong step, one bad decision. That's all it takes. They found his Jeep with its slashed tires. They questioned Kane, who played the part of the helpful old-timer perfectly, claiming the professor had never shown up at his cabin. After a week of finding no tracks, no sign, no trace, Croft made the call. He concluded that Dr. Omari Benton had likely fallen into one of the hundreds of unmarked, unmapped mine shafts that dotted the landscape, his body lost forever in the deep, dark veins of the earth. The case was closed. Another tragic, but unremarkable, victim of the desert's unforgiving nature. The year that followed was a study in two different kinds of survival, two parallel worlds of desperate, silent endurance. Above ground, Dr. Imani Benton waged a war against forgetting. The official closing of her brother's case was not an end for her. It was a declaration of war. She refused to accept the easy, fatalistic narrative that the Park Service had offered. Omari was too smart, too meticulous, too experienced to have simply gotten lost. The slashed tires, the strange encounter with the local prospector, It was a story that felt incomplete, a puzzle with missing pieces. She knew in her bones that something had happened to him, something that the by-the-book search had missed. Her grief, sharp and all-consuming at first, slowly transformed into a cold, focused resolve. A medical doctor by trade, she applied her own scientific rigor to her brother's disappearance. Her small apartment became a second office, its walls covered not with medical charts, but with topographical maps of Joshua Tree, satellite imagery, and timelines of Omari's last known movements. She launched a website, Find Omari Benton, a polished professional hub of information that stood in stark contrast to the grainy, desperate flyers of most missing persons cases. She meticulously documented every detail of the case, creating a public archive so that her brother could not be easily erased. She became an expert on every unsolved disappearance in the region, her research revealing a disturbing pattern of cases closed too quickly, of official narratives that didn't quite add up. She battled the Park Service's bureaucracy with a relentless barrage of Freedom of Information Act requests, emails, and phone calls. She became a familiar, unwelcome presence to lead Ranger Silas Croft, who saw her as a woman unable to accept the harsh reality of the desert. Dr. Benton, he told her during one tense phone call, 6 months after Omari had vanished. I understand your grief. I truly do. But you have to accept it. We did everything we could. This desert, it swallows people. There's nothing more we can do. That's not good enough, Ranger Croft, Imani had replied, her voice dangerously calm. My brother isn't a statistic. He's a man, and he's out there. And you stopped looking. Her fight took a toll. It strained her relationships, consumed her finances, and filled her nights with a quiet, lonely ache. But she never stopped. She was the keeper of her brother's memory, a solitary lighthouse keeper, tending a flame of hope against an ocean of indifference. Meanwhile, deep beneath the desert floor, Omari was waging his own war against a different kind of silence. His prison was an old, stone-lined water cistern, a relic from the mining days, about 10 feet in diameter and 15 feet deep. The darkness was absolute, a physical weight that pressed in on him. The silence was so profound that he could hear the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears. In the first days, panic was a constant, screaming presence. He clawed at the stone walls, his fingernails breaking against the rough mortar. He shouted until his voice was a raw, bloody whisper. But as the days turned into weeks, the geologist in him took over. His scientific mind, the very thing that had brought him to this desert, became his only tool for survival. He began to analyze his prison. He was a man of logic and reason trapped in an illogical nightmare. He ran his hands over the walls, feeling the texture of the stone, the coolness of the mortar. He realized the cistern was not completely dry. A slow, seasonal seep of groundwater trickled down one wall, creating a small, shallow pool of brackish, mineral-heavy water at the bottom. It wasn't much, but it was water. Using a strip of his own shirt, he devised a crude filtration system, painstakingly dripping the water through the fabric to remove the worst of the silt. Food was a more desperate problem. He had been carrying a small backpack when he was abducted. Inside were 3 high-protein energy bars and a small bag of trail mix. He rationed them with a brutal, scientific discipline, allowing himself only a few hundred calories a day. When that ran out after the first few weeks, a new, primal horror began. The gnawing hunger was a constant, physical torment. But even in this, his scientific mind sought a solution. He noticed that in the damp, cool environment, life persisted. Small, pale insects, crickets, beetles, and the larvae of flies found their way into the cistern. At first, the thought of eating them was repulsive. But as the days of starvation wore on, repulsion gave way to the simple, brutal calculus of survival. He was a scientist. He began to study them, using his knowledge of biology to identify which were likely safe to eat. He created small traps with pebbles, learning their patterns, their movements. This grim, nightly harvest became his new reality. It was a horrifying but necessary source of protein that kept his body from completely shutting down. He fought off the madness of the isolation by turning his prison into a laboratory. He would spend hours mapping the geology of the cistern from memory, reciting the names of the rock strata, the types of granite, the mineral composition. He would lecture to an imaginary classroom of students, his voice a low, raspy whisper in the dark, explaining the forces of uplift and erosion that had created this landscape. He recited the geological time scale, from the Precambrian to the Holocene, a litany of epochs that put his own suffering into a vast, almost comforting perspective. He was a scientist in a tomb, and he was waiting. He didn't know what for. He just knew that the first law of geology was that nothing, not even the deepest, most solid rock, stays the same forever. Sooner or later, everything shifts. 1 year after Dr. Omari Benin was swallowed by the desert, a new kind of eye was looking at the ancient landscape of Joshua Tree. It belonged to Karina Vega, a brilliant, tech-savvy geology graduate student from Caltech. Karina was not interested in the stories of old prospectors or the park's surface beauty. She was interested in the data hidden beneath it. Her doctoral thesis was a pioneering project, using cutting-edge, drone-based LiDAR, light detection, and ranging technology to create a high-resolution, three-dimensional map of the park's old mining districts. LiDAR works by bouncing millions of laser pulses off the ground, measuring the return time to create a precise topographical map that can digitally strip away vegetation and see the true shape of the earth beneath. Her project was designed to reveal hidden geological faults, to understand the deep structure of the land in a way no one had before. For months, she flew her custom-built drone over the rugged, inaccessible terrain around the old Scorpion's Tooth mine. The drone, a marvel of modern engineering, meticulously scanned the landscape, gathering terabytes of data. Back in her lab at Caltech, Karina began the painstaking process of rendering this data into a single, massive 3D model. She spent weeks cleaning the data, filtering out the noise, stitching together the thousands of individual scans. As the final image resolved on her large monitor, she felt a familiar thrill. The map was beautiful, a digital tapestry of canyons, ridges, and alluvial fans, rendered in stunning detail. She could see the faint, ghost-like traces of old mining roads that had been invisible for a century. She could identify subtle shifts in the rock strata that hinted at undiscovered fault lines. It was during a routine analysis of the area just north of the Scorpion's Tooth mine that the software flagged an anomaly. It was a small, almost insignificant deviation in the data, something that would have been invisible on any normal topographical map. But in the hyper-precise world of LiDAR, it stood out. Karina zoomed in. The data showed a perfect, man-made cylinder buried about 10 feet beneath the surface. It was geometrically too perfect to be natural. Its lines were too clean, its shape too uniform. It was not a collapsed mine shaft, which would have been irregular. It was not a natural well or a geological formation. It was a structure that didn't correspond to any known well, building, or septic tank on any park map, old or new. She ran the diagnostic again, thinking it was a glitch in the rendering, a data artifact. The result was the same. A perfect buried cylinder about 10 feet in diameter, in a place where there should be nothing but solid earth and rock. It was a digital ghost, a structure that shouldn't be there. Her first thought was that it must be an old, forgotten piece of mining equipment, perhaps a buried water tank. But the more she looked at it, the more it bothered her. The location was remote, far from the main mining operations. There was no logical reason for a tank to be there. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. She was a geologist, a scientist who dealt in facts and evidence. And the evidence before her pointed to something that was deliberately hidden. She didn't know what it was, but she knew she had a professional and ethical obligation to report it. She carefully documented the GPS coordinates of the anomaly, compiled her LiDAR data into a formal report, and, following university protocol, sent it to the chief geologist at the Joshua Tree National Park Service. She had no idea that her routine scientific report was about to become the key that would unlock a horrifying 1-year-old mystery. Corina Vega's report landed in the inbox of the Joshua Tree Park Service with all the urgency of a routine geological survey. It was logged, filed, and passed to a junior ranger, who, seeing the words unidentified subterranean object, classified it as a probable collapsed well or an old, forgotten septic tank from the mining era. It was noted for future, non-urgent inspection. In the vast, underfunded bureaucracy of the National Park Service, it was a piece of data destined to be buried in a digital file cabinet. But it was not completely buried. For a year, Dr. Imani Benton had maintained her vigil. Part of that vigil was a series of automated alerts she had set up, using keywords to monitor any official documents or reports filed by the Park Service that contained the phrases Scorpion's Tooth Mine or unidentified remains. When Corina's report was officially logged, a notification pinged on Imani's laptop. She read the report, her heart beginning to pound with a frantic, familiar rhythm. She saw the LiDAR images, the clean, perfect, unnatural shape of the buried cylinder. She saw the GPS coordinates, and cross-referencing them with her own extensive maps, she realized with a jolt that the anomaly was less than half a mile from where her brother's Jeep had been found with its tires slashed. It was a connection no one else could have made. To the Park Service, it was a random geological curiosity. To Imani, it was a potential tomb. She began a relentless, systematic campaign. She bombarded the Park Service with calls and emails. She didn't plead, she presented a case. She sent them Corina's data overlaid on her own maps, showing the proximity to the crime scene. She cited Park Service regulations regarding the investigation of unmapped structures. She CC'd her congressman, the state attorney general, and two prominent journalists who had covered her brother's case years ago. She was no longer just a grieving sister. She was a tenacious, well-informed advocate, and she was impossible to ignore. Her pressure campaign landed, with a thud, on the desk of Ranger Silas Croft. Croft, now nearing retirement, remembered Imani Benton with a weary sigh. He had always seen her as a tragic but obsessive figure, unable to accept the simple, brutal truth of the desert. But this was different. She wasn't coming to him with theories or grief. She was coming to him with hard, scientific data from a Caltech student. His professional obligation and a flicker of long-buried curiosity forced his hand. "All right, fine," he grumbled to his deputy after a particularly tense phone call with Imani. "Get a ground team together. Let's go take a look at this damn septic tank, so I can finally close the book on this woman." 2 days later, a team of 4 rangers, led by Croft, drove out to the coordinates. The area was just as desolate and unremarkable as he remembered. They found the spot easily enough, thanks to the precise GPS data. At first, they saw nothing but a flat expanse of sand and rock. "See," Croft said, a note of vindicated annoyance in his voice. "Nothing here." But a younger ranger, walking the perimeter, kicked at a large, flat slab of granite that was half buried in the sand. It didn't move like a natural rock. It seemed to pivot slightly. Intrigued, they brought over shovels and began to dig around it. It was a single, massive, flat piece of granite, about 5 feet by 5 feet, and it had been artificially placed a lid on the earth. It took all 4 of them, using heavy pry bars, to lever the massive stone slab aside. Beneath it, the sight made them all fall silent. It was not an old well or a septic tank opening. It was a heavy, modern, circular steel manhole cover, the kind used for industrial water systems. Its edges were sealed shut with a thick, black, industrial-grade epoxy, and the handle had been deliberately cut off. This was not a relic from the mining days. This was something else, something that had been sealed intentionally and recently from the outside. Croft stared at the modern seal, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. For the first time in a year, he considered the possibility that the grieving sister had been right all along. The discovery of a modern, professionally sealed hatch in the middle of the desert, in the exact location of a 1-year-old disappearance, transformed the situation from a routine inspection into a major crime scene. Ranger Silas Croft, his cynicism shattered, immediately called for a specialized state police team and a forensics unit. The team arrived by helicopter, The thumping of the rotor blades a violent intrusion into the desert's profound silence. They used a portable, high-powered cutting torch to break the epoxy seal around the manhole cover. The process was slow and painstaking, the air filling with the acrid smell of burning resin and hot metal. When the seal was finally broken, they attached a winch to the heavy steel lid and lifted it away, revealing a dark, circular maw leading down into the earth. A wave of cool, stale, foul air rose from the opening. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed for a very long time. The smell of stagnant water, of damp stone, of human despair. 2 state troopers, their faces grim, were harnessed and lowered into the darkness. Their helmet-mounted lights cut through the gloom. They were inside a deep, stone-lined cistern. At the bottom, about 15 feet down, was a shallow pool of black, murky water. And on a small, dry ledge just above the waterline, huddled against the curved stone wall, was a human figure. He was emaciated, his body skeletal, his skin a pale, almost luminous white from a year without sunlight. A long, matted beard covered his chest. He was alive, but only just. He looked up at the troopers, his eyes, clouded and unfocused, blinking slowly in the sudden, painful glare of their lights. The rescue was slow and delicate. A paramedic was lowered into the cistern. He stabilized the man, wrapping him in thermal blankets and starting in 4. The man was too weak to climb. He had to be strapped into a rescue harness and carefully hoisted to the surface. When he was finally brought out into the sunlight, the entire team fell silent. He was a ghost, a relic from a lost world. Dr. Imani Benton, who had arrived with the state police, pushed her way through the crowd of officers. She looked at the skeletal man on the stretcher, at his face, which she had only seen in old photographs for the past year. "Omari," she whispered, her voice breaking. The man on the stretcher turned his head toward the sound of her voice. His cracked lips parted. A dry, rasping sound, the first sound he had made, emerged from his throat. It was her name, Imani. He was airlifted to a specialized medical center. During the flight, and later in the hospital, lucid and with the calm precision of the scientist he still was, he told the stunned investigators his story. He described the slashed tires, the drugged water, the horror of waking up in the dark. He named his captor, Jedediah Kane, the old prospector. He then explained, in clear, scientific terms, how he had survived. His knowledge of geology had saved his life. He knew the cistern was fed by a slow, seasonal groundwater seep through a specific layer of porous sandstone. He knew the water, while brackish, was not poisonous. He had used his own shirt, day after day, to filter out the silt, collecting a few precious, life-sustaining ounces of drinkable water. He described the grim, necessary act of trapping and eating insects to keep his body from shutting down completely. He had survived not by luck, but by science. He had turned his tomb into a laboratory, his body the subject of his own desperate, 1-year-long experiment. The story of Dr. Omari Benton's survival became an international sensation. It was a modern-day miracle, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of a brilliant mind. The arrest of Jedediah Kane was a far quieter affair. A team of state police found him at his remote, ramshackle cabin, sitting on his porch, rocking slowly in a wooden chair, as if he had been expecting them. He was unrepentant. He did not confess, he proclaimed. He calmly told the authorities that the land and everything on it, including Dr. Benton, belonged to him. He explained that Omari, a black man, a city professor, had been trespassing on his family's legacy, poking at the bones of his ancestors. He had not tried to kill him. He had simply put him back in the earth. He saw his act not as a crime, but as a righteous act of ownership, a reassertion of an old, forgotten order. His racism was so profound, so deeply ingrained, that he could not comprehend his own monstrosity. The trial was a media circus, a surreal clash of centuries. On one side was the prosecution, with its LiDAR maps, its forensic evidence, its story of scientific survival. On the other was Jedediah Kane and his court-appointed lawyer, a man who seemed as bewildered by his client as everyone else. Kane sat through the proceedings with a look of calm, quiet contempt, a ghost from a violent, proprietary past, judging the modern world that had dared to judge him. He was swiftly convicted and sentenced to life in prison, where he would die a few years later, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. A year after his rescue, after a long, arduous process of physical and psychological recovery, Dr. Omari Benton returned to Joshua Tree. He was still thin, his skin still pale, his eyes still adjusting to the brightness of a world. But he was walking on his own, his body slowly remembering how to be alive. He was not there for research. He had arranged to meet someone. He stood at the edge of the now-empty cistern, the stone scar on the landscape that had been his world for a year. A young woman approached him. It was Karina Vega, the graduate student whose data had found him. She was nervous, awed to be in his presence. "Dr. Benton," she said, her voice quiet. I'm so sorry for what happened to you. I'm glad my work could help." Omari looked at her bright, intelligent face, and a faint, sad smile touched his lips. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said, his voice still raspy but clear. "You did what a good scientist does. You looked at the data, and you asked a question. You listened to what the Earth was trying to tell you." He asked her to show him her maps, the 3D renderings from her LiDAR drone. She pulled out her tablet, and together, they looked at the beautiful, intricate images of the desert's hidden architecture. He saw the passion in her eyes, the same passion he had once had. "Thank you," he said again, but this time it was different. It was not just for saving his life. "Thank you for proving that there are still stories waiting to be found, if you just have the right tools and the courage to look." He looked out at the vast, silent desert, the landscape of his imprisonment and his salvation. The sun was setting, painting the granite monoliths in hues of orange and pink and deep, bruised purple. He understood, with a profound, hard-won clarity, that the desert did not swallow people. It held them. It kept their secrets. And sometimes, if you knew how to listen, it even told you where to find them.